Mr. Anthony T. Browder, welcome to the show today.
It's my pleasure, and thank you for this opportunity to talk with you and share my information with your listeners. Appreciate
Absolutely,
it.
absolutely. I must let you know before we get started that this was a personal request of mine. I was asked if I had like a wish list of people that I could have a conversation with. Who would those people be? And you were at the top of that very short list. Been very fortunate, but one person I haven't been able to like really pick your brain is you. And so today is actually very meaningful for me. I spent a lot of time programming radio stations, just choosing songs and listening to your lectures, playing in the background, just kind of learning the history. And I like to think that some of your words influence some of the playlists that, my city ended up listening to in a positive and meaningful way. So again, the pleasure is mine today.
So let me ask you a question before we get started.
Please.
I'm appreciative of the fact that you saw fit to invite me to be on this podcast today. Mm-hmm. How old are you?
I'm 40 years old. Yes, absolutely. How? 40 years old.
40 years old. Okay. Mm-hmm. So what interested you as a 40-year-old man? What interested you in the things that I've been talking about since before you were born?
That's a great question. I love that. So this is part of the reason why this conversation is so meaningful for me. I grew up in the Christian tradition. My father was a minister. His father was a minister. One of the things about my father was he was very educated. His doctorate was in theology. And something that I learned from him is that when you become more educated, you tend to harbor less prejudices and less ignorance. And so by the time I was born, my father was very old when I was born. My father did not teach any prejudices, any biases to me or to my brothers and sisters. Rather, he taught us from the Bible, of course, that's as you do in that type of household. But it was more of, this is the example after which we can model our lives to be the type of people that we want to be. But this is no more right or wrong than any other faith tradition. This is the one that we do in this house, right? And so without having those prejudices, me growing up and getting out into the world, I was able to travel, go to other churches and worship with other people, through my own, methods and using my own sort of aperture into the spiritual realm. But I got to fellowship with people who were Muslim, people who were Sikh, people who were Jewish and so forth. And I think that sort of culminated into when I had my 40th birthday, a trip that I took to Egypt. My name is Ramses, and I'm sure you are well aware of the connection. And so I've been very connected to Egypt, Egyptology, the history of Egypt, and the history of Africa in Egypt as well, my whole life. And so for my 40th birthday, my father passed when I was, it was sort of right after I started listening to your lectures, which was my early 30s. But my mid 30s, my father passed. So me making my way to Egypt for my 40th birthday was very significant. And the teachings in your lectures were kind of rumbling back and forth in my head. We had a great tour guide and so forth, but I had such a strong framework and foundation going over there to absorb the history, the culture, the faith traditions and so forth. And then the lineage of the stories, which I hope that we'll get to in today's conversation. But today's conversation, I asked honestly for it because of those reasons, and I'm sure many more.
All right. Another short question. Why did your father name you Ramses? Do you know?
My father felt that Ramses was a person that did a lot for Egypt. And he felt that the name really suited his son. It means the son of the god of the sun, loosely translated. And he felt that was appropriate for me. He just kind of knew that before I was born. And so I've loved my name my whole life.
And so your father obviously was wise beyond his years, because in the Christian tradition, Ramesses is considered to be the king of the Exodus.
Exactly.
So for your father to name you Ramesses meant that he knew more than a lot of his fellow pastors. So that's a very good sign. It's an honor and a pleasure to meet your acquaintance and have this interview with you.
I appreciate that. So let's talk about you. One of the things we do on the show here is kind of very similar to what we've just done, but this time let's make it about you. So for our listeners who may not be as familiar, share a bit about yourself, maybe some of your origin story, your upbringings, and ultimately what led you to your career path.
Sure. Well, I am a product of Chicago, Illinois. I was born in 1951, 71 years old, and grew up on the west side of Chicago in a segregated community. My first years of my life, I went to predominantly all-Black school, had Black teachers, and this was during a time frame when Black teachers were very concerned about the education of the Black children in their classroom. They understood that education is a pathway to empowerment, to success. And so they made sure that we appreciated the value of reading and writing and arithmetic. And that established a love of learning in me early in life. And I left Chicago after my freshman year in college, and I felt that it was time for me to get away. You know, Chicago then I left Chicago in 1971. Chicago then, as Chicago is now, one of the most racially segregated cities in the United States. The violence was just beginning to increase again in my community. And I've been shot at a couple of times, been jumped on by gangs of Black folk, jumped on by gangs of white folk. And I felt the need to leave Chicago and go someplace else where I could pursue a life without all of these racial distractions. And I decided to come to Washington, D.C. to attend Howard University. So I've lived in D.C. for 51 years now. D.C. was phenomenal for facilitating my growth into manhood. I had the opportunity back in those days, 71 through the 70s and mid 80s, DC was Chocolate City. We had over 70%, 71% African Americans in the city. The city council, the mayors were predominantly people of African ancestry. At Howard University, we had a large international community. And I met Black folk from all over the world with different religions, different levels of understanding, different perspectives. And I grew to understand and appreciate what it meant to be a person of African ancestry living in Washington, D.C., living in the United States, and ultimately living in the world. And after graduation, I met a brother who was the first person of African Caribbean descent in Washington to introduce the Akan traditions to the DC community. And I took a 7-week class with him on African spirituality. And that 7-week class changed my life. It made me aware of some of the things, some of the experiences, and some of the knowledge that was missing in my upbringing, and gave me a foundation upon which I could move forward into adulthood. And that 7-week class led to my meeting Dr. Ivan Van Sertima on February the 21st, 1977. Dr. Van Sertima had just published his landmark book, They Came Before Columbus, The African Presence in America, where he documented the fact that Africans from the Nile Valley built ships, navigated the Mediterranean Sea, the Atlantic Ocean, and made numerous journeys to the Americas between 1200 and 600 BC. And that these Africans were from Egypt and the Egyptians were Black. This is the first time in my life that any person had ever told me that the ancient Egyptians were Black. So my mind was blown, because like most people, I grew up having a fascination with Egypt and the pyramids and the temples and tombs, but nowhere in my formal educational process, nowhere in any of the books that I had read, any of the movies I had seen, was I told that the ancient Egyptians were in fact African. That blew my mind and set me on the path to find out what else I didn't know. So that meeting with Van Sertima resulted in my discovering books by authors, John Henry Clark, Joseph Ben-Jochannan, John Jackson, and other scholars who became my teachers, my facilitators, who helped to re-educate me. And as a result of reading their books and ultimately over time meeting them, I had the occasion to travel to Egypt in 1980 with Dr. Joseph Ben-Jochannan, one of the foremost Egyptologists and scholars at that time. And that 13-day trip that I spent on the Nile changed my life because I had the opportunity to see with my own eyes monuments, documents, images that were thousands of years old of African people in control of their own destiny. And I realized then that I had been lied to, and oftentimes lied to by people who look like me, which reinforced the fact that we only know what we know. And it begs the question, who's responsible for teaching you what you know? And if your teachers are miseducated, it means that the students that they teach will also be miseducated. So I established IKG in 1982 as an organization that would facilitate the re-education of people of African descent. My primary interest then was to make sure that my colleagues, my friends, my people would not be as miseducated as I was. And then that started my 4 decades long journey into researching, traveling, and then sharing my research and my findings with the wider community, which ultimately led to you discovering me and me being here to do this podcast with you. So that's, in summary, my life.
I love it. I love it. It makes a lot of sense. So you mentioned, your research and the things that you managed to uncover. I want to kind of connect that with sort of your how you describe the work that you do. So let's explain to our listeners what a cultural memory specialist is.
Cultural memory specialist is a person, historians study history. History is literally his story. So whenever someone tells their story, they're telling you what they want you to know, and are oftentimes eliminating information that they don't want you to know. So as one of my teachers, John Henry Clark, said, that all history is a current event. And if you understand the purpose of history, which is to tell you who you were, who you are, and who you can become, if we've been fed false history, and history is nothing but memories of the past. So false history creates false memories, and false memories are our reference points to understand what happened in the past. So my job, my responsibility is to reinterpret the historical memory of the past and present this information such that it will create new memories in the people that I'm reaching out to, so that these new memories that show the glory, the power, the length and breadth of the presence of African people on the planet then becomes a mental, emotional, and psychological reference point that others can use to understand how they got where they are at this present moment, have a great understanding of the world that we all have to move around in, and make conscious choices on what you can do, given all of those factors, to create the world that you plan to move into a year from now, a decade from now, 2 decades from now, and to leave a path for the generations who are coming behind you. So I take a very holistic approach to my understanding, my interpretation, and the practical application of historical information. So I think I answered your question.
Yeah. I love it. Yeah. There's I always felt like, with my name, with a lot of the friends, teachers, in my life growing up, that I had a pretty accurate view, or at least a more in-depth view of what Egypt was, who ancient Egyptians were. And I realized that even I had been miseducated. When I got to Egypt, like you, I saw some of the hieroglyphs that were 5,000 years old and still very much intact and legible. But there's something that I learned, and I'd like to kind of get your thoughts on this, but it's something I learned, and hopefully I'm telling the story right. The Black history in Egypt is more pronounced than we are taught. And this is something that I had to learn when I was there. I learned that ancient Egypt was effectively, it was two tribes coming together. And one of those tribes was, in fact, the Nubian tribe. And the legacy of that, the joining of those two tribes resulted in I'm forgetting the name. What's the name of the headdress that the pharaoh would wear? It's like the
Nimitz headdress.
Right. And then there would be a raven, I believe, and a snake or serpent next to each other, and that would represent the two tribes. Cobra.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, okay.
So I may not have it right, but I'd love to expound upon that, the Black skin tradition, because it's whitewashed in movies, and you go to Vegas, you see the Luxor, and then you see these at best medium toned people, but there is indeed a Black skin tradition and history in Egypt.
Mm-hmm. Well, Ramses, you're really proving my point. Everybody has been miseducated.
Okay. So please.
And I can say, based on my own personal experiences, having studied this field of history for over 40 years,
mm-hmm.
after having made 65 trips to Egypt over the past 42 years, after having spent 14 and a half years financing and participating in an archaeological excavation on the west bank of Luxor, Egypt, I can say that I have a decent understanding of this ancient history.
Mm-hmm.
And I can say from personal experiences that at least 90% of what we've been taught to this very day is wrong.
Yeah.
You can throw it out the window. It's wrong.
Okay.
First of all, most of what we know about Egypt has been written by the conquerors of Egypt,
okay.
The non-African conquerors of Egypt. And as I said, when people write history, they tell you their story and they leave out other people's story, or they present those other people in an unflattering, untruthful light. That has been the case with the history of Egypt. Egypt is a Greek word. Pyramid is a Greek word. Sphinx is a Greek word.
Right.
Hieroglyphics is a Greek word. So if you cannot call those objects or those places by their original names, you've been miseducated. You don't know what you're dealing with, and you don't know what you're talking about.
Okay.
So that's the bottom line. Egypt was the Greek name for one temple in the northern part of the country, Ha-Ka-Ptah. Ha-Ka-Ptah, the temple of the Ka, of the spirit of Ptah, who was the nectar associated with the creation of the world. His temple was, the name of his temple was bastardized by the Greeks. They couldn't say Ha-Ka-Ptah, and that became Egyptus, which eventually became Egypt. So the name of the entire country is named after the Greeks' inability to articulate the name of one temple.
Wow.
Sphinx is a Greek word, which means to strangle or to hold. And the story of the Sphinx that we have been given comes from the Greek playwright Sophocles, which is associated with King Oedipus. So if you are relying on the Greek version of Egyptian history to define Egyptian history, you don't know Egypt. Pyramid is a Greek word, which means little flat cake.
Wow.
Right? So the first thing that one has to do is deal with chronology, to know what Egypt was before the Greeks came in and renamed it Egypt. Chronology. Who were the original founders of this ancient civilization? You have to understand terminology. Right? You have to know the difference between Greek words. You have to know the difference between Egypt and Kemet. Kemet is the original name of that country.
Right.
You have to know the difference between Sphinx and Aket, which is the original name for the statue that the Greeks called the Sphinx. You have to know the difference between pyramid and mirror. If you don't know those differences, you don't know squat. And so since most of us have been fed the Greek, the Roman, the French, the German, the British, and now the Arab interpretation of African history, we don't know what's been eliminated, what's been distorted. And to make matters worse, we don't know that we don't know. So we speak from an air of, with an air of confidence and authority about things that we know nothing about. So when, I have this discussion with my Egyptian friends who've lived in Egypt all their lives and are telling me their history, I just sit back and smile. And then I lay out the chronology. I show them when Arabs came into Egypt, 648. I show them when Romans came into Egypt, 30 BC. I show them when Greeks came to Egypt in 332 BC. And then I take them back to the very beginning of that history and culture, when there were no Greeks, no Romans, no Arabs, just African people. And then lay out the story of the beginnings of that culture from an African perspective, and it changes everything that they thought they knew.
Really? I love that.
Oh, yeah.
I love it. So let's talk about IKG. And let's talk about,
Sure.
There's some of the other endeavors that you have going on that will help us reconnect with our actual history.
So IKG was the second company that I founded. My first company I founded in 1979, and it was called EKG, East Coast Graphics. My degree, my background is in graphic design and advertising. I'm an artist at heart. I'm trained as an artist. And as a result of that training, I have cultivated an artist's eye. Artists, whether they're visual artists or performing artists are primarily right brain oriented. And that right brain is that creative faculty. It's that intuitive faculty. So a properly trained artist can look at something, can look at a building or look at an object and see things that someone who is not trained in art can't see. Shapes, spaces, negative space, positive space, symbolism that's embedded in the work of art says something different to an artist than it does to someone who's not trained in that art. And so the purpose of my creating my design studio was because I learned early in my life, I learned early in my career that as long as I worked for someone, they would never truly appreciate my value. And I decided I didn't want to work for anybody else. So I created my own business. So having my own design studio afforded me the opportunity to work as hard as I wanted to work, to make as much money that I wanted to make in order to do the things that I wanted to do. And at that point in time in my life in 1979, I was interested in learning as much as I could about the history of ancient Egypt. So I was buying books, I was reading books, I was traveling to conferences to meet the authors of the books that I loved. I was able to have conversations with them and cultivate relationships with them. Thus, when I traveled to Egypt in 1980, I was in a position now to synthesize all that I've been reading and studying on my own so that I could get a deeper understanding of what it was I was experiencing. And when I returned to Washington, D.C., where I was living at that time, I decided to then use my graphic design, marketing, and advertising skills to create my second business, IKG, in order to facilitate the means by which I could produce information that would be appealing to people who've been socialized to not have an interest in reading and not have an interest in history. So if I can take this information that I had learned and distill it into, bite-sized morsels of information that would make people cultivate an interest in what they were reading and steer them to want to read more or learn more about a subject, then I've got an audience that I can work with. So that's what I've been doing through IKG for the past be 41 years next month. Mm-hmm. So I write like an artist. In other words, I use my words in order to create images in the mind of the reader so that they can see what I'm talking about. And I'm also detailing information about the positive portrayal of the worldwide African experience that butts against the negative images that every person who's been educated in America has been brainwashed to believe that African people have made no contributions to culture and civilization, and that we are the lowest of the low. So when you present a counterpoint to that based on factual information, here's the truth, here's the evidence to back up that truth, then what that does is it changes the neural pathways of a person. They start thinking differently. And as a result of thinking differently, it changes their body chemistry and they start feeling differently. And it moves them in a different place. So, because of, the time that I have spent throughout my career associated with some of the most brilliant Black psychologists in the world, Asa Hilliard, Naeem Akbar, Wade Nobles, because of my affiliations with some of the most brilliant psychiatrists in the world, Dr. Francis Cress Wellesley, Richard King, Patricia Newton, I've gained a deep understanding of how the mind works and how to present information to shift the thinking of a person who internalizes this information such that they become a different people, right? Mm-hmm. So that's what IKG has been doing. That's what our work is about. And I'm sure since this interview is taking place in January of 2023, I'm sure anybody listening to this interview will realize that we still have a long ways to go. Governor DeSantis in Florida has banned an African education curriculum for high schools in Florida simply because he doesn't agree with that information. So we're still fighting wars against miseducation to this very day. We still have a long ways to go, and the work that I'm doing is probably more relevant now than it was at any point in time in our history.
So I don't want to gloss over this, but I do want to talk about the curriculum in schools, particularly with the DeSantis headlines that are making the news right now. But before we move on, I believe it's pronounced the ASA Restoration Project. Is that do I have that right?
Thank you for getting that right. Yes, okay. The ASA Restoration Project.
Okay, so I want you to touch on that as well, please.
Sure. Well, I mentioned previously a psychologist who had a profound impact in my life, and that was Asa G. Hilliard III. Mm-hmm. Asa wrote the introduction to my very first book from the Browder file, which was published in 1989. Asa was one of the founding members of the Association of Black Psychologists, an organization that I was affiliated with from the 1980s to the present. And this was a group of Black psychologists who realized early in their careers that they had been miseducated and that they had been taught white psychology and they knew nothing about Black psychology. So they began to study the mind of Black people from the perspective of Black people and not white folk. And they came up with an entirely different interpretation of Black psychology. As a matter of fact, it was Wade Nobles, another psychologist, also a founding member of ABPSI, the Association of Black Psychologists, who did his research and found that even the word psychology, which derives from the Greek word psyche and the Greek word logos, a knowledge of psyche, that word psyche is derived from an ancient African word, saku, which means spirit. So psychology is really the knowledge of the spirit, the human spirit. that aspect of your being that animates you, that connects you with the creator and everything on earth. So African people have a holistic approach to life and everything that that encompasses life, both the seen and the unseen, the visible and the invisible, the physical and the spiritual. So this is a more comprehensive understanding. So ASA was one of the principal players in this new field of study, and was just a wonderful human being, a wonderful brother who kind of took me under his wing and was accessible to me. ASA was also doing lectures on Egyptian history and leading study tours to Egypt. So a lot of what I do, a lot of what I have done is modeled after what I learned from watching and being in the presence of Asa Hilliard. And so when he died rather suddenly in August 13th, 2007, his death literally left a hole in my soul, left a void in my life. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I've learned from Dr. Hilliard and some of the other scholars that I referenced earlier is that African people understand that the power of spirit, the power of our ancestors. And one of the things that one knows is that when a person dies and becomes an ancestor, it is the responsibility of the living to remember that person, to name streets after them, to name buildings and projects after them, to pour libation to them, to call their name, because it's in the calling of their name, it's in the thinking of them that their spirit is drawn to you, that they continue to live through you. So as a result of the sudden passing of Asa, I was presented with an opportunity less than a year after his death to become involved in helping to support and ultimately finance an archaeological excavation in Egypt, an excavation of what was then 3 25th dynasty tombs, 3 Kushite tombs. Mm-hmm. So I established the ASA Restoration Project in order to uncover the history of the Kushite presence in ancient Kemet. The people that the Romans referred to as Nubians were Kushites. Okay. And Kemet is the original name for the country that the Greeks called Egypt. So I'm following ASA's mandate and going back to the source. So we want to be able to substantiate the Kushite presence in Kemet, as well as to honor the legacy of Asa G. Hilliard III. So that organization has been in existence for 14 and a half years now. And 14 and a half years into this project, we started off in 2008 with 3 tombs. We ended our season last November with 35 tombs. So we have uncovered a plethora of information, which is literally allowing us to rewrite the history of the Kushite presence in Kemet, and ultimately rewrite the history of Kemet based on actual historical information and not feel-good information that we're just pulling out of thin air simply because we're trying to find a home for Black people among the history of the people of the world.
You know, I think that this, you're making, there's a lot of people who are in support of educating our youth, and you're making as good a case as anyone I've ever seen. And I realized this is why I kind of went into my own experience humbly, knowing that there are a lot of things that I've learned that may not be true, right? They may, like you said, be feel good, things. And this is why I was like, you know better than me, of course. But of course, that thirst for knowledge, that thirst for just the basic understanding that there may be something else to the story, that was profound. And again, something that I found very early on, just kind of, coming across your conversations with, Rock Newman and, just the many works that you've done and that were available to me online. So that brings me to, a point that you were making earlier about what we're doing about our youth. So I definitely want to get your thoughts. I believe it was stated by DeSantis and the governing educational body in Florida that the AP African American Studies class lacked significant educational value. I believe that's exactly what they said. I want to get your thoughts on why African and African American education is important, and why you think there's such a push back when we're trying to educate ourselves, when there's not as profound of an attack on Holocaust education or, the eradication of indigenous tribes. It's whitewash stories, but it's not completely, gone from the curriculum. As an educator and as a person with such, monumental insight, I want to get your thoughts.
Well, I would say let's go to the words of Dr. Carter G. Woodson, who wrote the book on this process of miseducation. As a matter of fact, that book is 90 years old now. The book is entitled The Miseducation of the Negro. And the whole purpose behind miseducation is, to paraphrase Woodson, if you control a person's thinking through the process of miseducation, you don't have to worry about their actions. You don't have to worry about what they do. If you control a person's thinking through miseducation, you won't have to tell that person to stand here or to go there, because they will find their proper place and they will stay in it. A person who has been miseducated will not have to be ordered to go to the back door of any society, because they will find their proper, if there is no back door, they will create one for their special purposes. That's the purpose of education, to instill in the mind of people a sense of superiority or inferiority. And when it comes to people of African descent here in America, people who were forcefully dragged from their homeland in chains and enslaved for over 250 years in this country, and then subjected to Jim Crow, segregation, and lynching for almost 100 years, and then went through 13 years of a civil rights movement before they were given the basic rights, freedom, justice, and equality. And then once that legislation was introduced in the 1960s and Blacks integrated into American society, that integration, as Dr. King correctly theorized, that integration was the integration into a burning house. And as a consequence, people of African descent today in 2023 are in worse shape educationally than we've been in the last 100 years. Because we no longer have those Black schools that I was telling you that I had grown up in, where there were teachers who looked like me, who had a vested interest in making sure that I understood the value of education and that I learned to read, to write, and to reason. That's not happening in school systems anymore. If you talk to any educator or any administrator, they would tell you that schools now have been preoccupied with teaching to the test. So there's certain core information that they are mandated by law to make sure that a significant number of teachers within their classroom, within their school or their district must pass a test in order for them to continue to get funding from the state or the federal government. So there's no education going on anymore. It's preparing students to remember certain lessons so that they can pass a test, so the school districts can get money to continue the process of miseducation. That's what's been happening. And it's happening now on steroids. And so as a consequence, people like DeSantis and other right-wing Republicans are fearful of the type of information that my colleagues and I have dedicated our lives to researching, documenting, and making accessible to school systems, because they know that this information runs contrary to the acceptable narrative. And if you recall last year, as this debate was going on in school districts throughout the country, particularly in the South, one of their justifications for limiting this so-called African-centered information is because it would make the white students in the classroom feel bad.
Yeah.
They didn't want to hurt their feelings.
Yeah.
So essentially what that says is they don't give a damn about how Black and brown people feel in the classrooms, learning that Christopher Columbus discovered America, learning that slavery was referred to by some folk as involuntary servitude, right? So they don't care about our feelings. That's clear. That's obvious. And given that reality, then what should we care about? How should we care about that? And so my position has always been to look after our family first. Mm-hmm. So if you are not actively involved in going to the school board meetings in your community, if you're not actively involved in holding schools accountable to ensure that your tax dollars are used to make sure that in your child's classroom, there's information that uplifts the psyche of your child and makes them feel good about themselves. Now, school is more than just feeling good, but when a Black child is in a classroom and hears about the fact that Africans had traveled to the Americas 2,500 years before Christopher Columbus was born, and they see the physical evidence of the 20 some odd statues in Mexico of the people who were classified as the Olmecs, who brought technology, who brought architecture, who brought engineering, who brought a knowledge of theology and the calendar to the indigenous Americans, and see how the indigenous Americans acknowledge their presence. Those are real historical facts that everybody needs to know, not just Black children or brown children, but everybody in every classroom needs to know this information. And they need to know this information not just during February, Black History Month. This is world history, okay? Absolutely. So one of the things that I've been concerned about is raising the awareness of young people like you and elders like me so that we can become responsible advocates for our children and for those who have yet to be born, so that we can insist that our tax dollars be used to educate everybody in the classroom so that they can have a different understanding of themselves and their potential. And trust me, brother, none of this information has anything to do with making white folk feel bad.
Bad. I know.
It's about telling and teaching historical truths and teaching the young folk in the classroom how to be objective in internalizing that truth.
Yeah.
Right. And how they can use those truths to empower themselves and assume responsibility for making sure that this nation lives up to its creed that all people are created equal and all people have a right to freedom, justice, and equality. That's what's at stake. So helping students become good civil servants, right? Responsible citizens of society is really what this movement, if you will, is all about. Mm-hmm. And that only happens when you know the truth and you can bind yourself to that truth, which is such a transformative entity.
You know, there's something I was going to say. I came across recently a meme on, my social media feed, and it was a photo of David Banner, who's an MC. Okay, you're familiar. And David Banner was like an artistic photograph, an aesthetic photograph of him just kind of with that powerful frame of his, and he was reading a book, and it was one of your books, right? Beautiful photograph, very powerful image. And, as you were speaking right now, it brought me the thought, and I hope I don't get this wrong, but I believe that there was a group of people, maybe you were involved, maybe not, but they were trying to get your book involved to a degree or something like that in some sort of curriculum, right, for students to be able to read. And there was some pushback against that. So before we get too far from this point in the conversation, I would love for you to help us circumvent those traditional avenues and educate our children by ourselves. So please plug, any books, anything like that you've written that you feel like we need to know right now. We're certainly going to circle back, but I'd love to make sure that we touch on that while we're here.
Sure. The picture that you're talking about is this picture.
That's it. That's it.
Banner, reading the Browder file, and about about 8 or 9 years ago, I received a call from David. Called me up out the blue, and just said how much reading that book as a teenager. I think he was a sophomore in high school. How much reading that book changed his life. He said it was the first book he ever read from cover to cover. I think he said he was a sophomore in high school, going to high school in Mississippi. Mm-hmm. And so he has made it a point to buy cases of that book to give to sophomore students in his former high school, so that some of these students could have the same transformative experience that he had upon reading that book. So Banner is a dear friend. Banner is a brother who understood how people in his line of work have been socialized to focus on and expand the worst of African people, the criminality, the abuse of women. And once he learned something about who he was as a person of African descent, he shifted. He said, I can't do that anymore. And so what we're looking at is creating a movement among people whose consciousness has been awakened. And I don't particularly like the term woke because, anyway. So what we have been doing is, through IKG specifically, writing books, publishing books, disseminating books, so that people can study on their own and begin to understand the real history that is associated with them, and then to show them how to use this information to advocate for the children in your household, the children in your community. Mm-hmm. So I'm a firm believer of the fact that education begins at home.
Yes.
And more specifically, education begins in the womb. Education begins in the womb. And that if you have more video games and more televisions in your home than you have books, there's going to be problems in your household. If you spend more time playing video games, watching television than you do reading, there's going to be problems in your communities and in the classrooms in your communities. So I'm an advocate of working within and outside of the system, and that knowledge, specifically knowledge of self, is the best means by which a people can know who they are and live up to their potential and change how they move through what is still a racist and self-destructive society. And if we want to save ourselves, we're going to have to assume responsibility for saving ourselves, because nobody else would do it. Our so-called belief system, the God of our belief system, is not going to save us. Mm-hmm. If that were true, then we probably would not have been enslaved in the first place. We wouldn't have been lynched in the first place. That's a whole nother subject matter. But the reality is, politicians are not going to save us. Any civil rights legislation can be undone, just like the Supreme Court is in the process of undoing some important educational rulings that have stood for several decades. So we see the rug is being pulled out from under Black folk right now. As I mentioned, I'm 71 years old, and this racial climate that we've been experiencing here in America, particularly over the past 7 years, has been the worst I've ever seen in my life. And I've seen some pretty horrific things. And so something is coming. And if you don't know what's coming, if you don't know how to prepare for what's coming, you'll be like the victims of Katrina, who didn't have the resources to get out, and you'll be standing on top of a roof with the sign that says, "Help me," but there'll be no one to come to your assistance. So history can teach us cycles of the past, how those same cycles are manifesting themselves today. And those people who are good stewards of history can then use that knowledge to prepare themselves for what they know is coming based on the cyclical nature of history. So I've been advocating for years through IKG that Black people study Black history, and more specifically, our relationship with white people, so that we can better determine who is for us and who is against us, and use our time, our talent, and our treasure to ensure that we not only survive what is coming, but we thrive because of specific decisions that we made and specific information that we have passed down to our children,
Mm-hmm.
so that they're able to benefit from this knowledge and continue to perpetuate information that will ensure our continued success and our continued ability to thrive in the United States of America, which is, based on my study, the United States of America is the wealthiest, most powerful nation in human history.
Mm-hmm.
If you can't make it in America, there's something wrong with you, right? And that's real. Despite the racism, despite the prejudice, despite all the obstacles, we have a better chance of making it here in this country than any place in the world. And with the knowledge of how this country works and how the world works and our place in the world, we can use that knowledge to not only survive in America, but to thrive in this country and be a benefit to other African people all over the world who look to African Americans for models of how to live.
Mm.
You know, folk not only follow our music, they not only follow our cultural traditions, they admire us because we've been able to accomplish what no other oppressed people on the planet have been able to accomplish. And once a significant number of young African Americans, such as yourself, understand what's at stake and shift your thinking to commit yourself to something bigger than your own individual lives, then we will find ourselves in a position to adequately direct the future of this country and ultimately the future of this world based on how we've shifted our thinking, how we've shifted our action, and how those actions are now shifting the course of the world. That's what's at stake. That's why people like DeSantis and others don't want this information to be taught in the classrooms, because it changes how you see yourself, it changes how you think, it changes how you act, it changes everything. And they are literally fighting for their survival because they know that they know that the time of rule is rapidly coming to an end.
Yeah.
They're holding on to power for as long as they can, and they are in their minds justified to do whatever they have to do to hold on to power for as long as they can.
It's a very scary thing to witness. You're absolutely right. And I want to add to that, because there's a
So wait, let me just check you on that, right?
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that the Christians would teach you is that fear is the absence of God.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not about being scared. It's not about being afraid. It's about knowing. And that knowledge cancels out fear, right? Mm-hmm. That knowledge empowers you to do the things that you've always had the capacity to do and that you were born to do by virtue of the fact that you have taken a breath on this planet. So my suggestion, brother, is to don't look at it as something to be fearful of. Look at it as an opportunity for you to step into the full glory as to why you were born here on this earth in the first place.
I'll take that. And that's actually where I wanted to go with the next question. You mentioned something earlier about the word psychology being connected to an African word, right? And, you know, because I'm familiar with a lot of your talks, I realize that there is a lot of connections, African connections, in Christianity, and indeed a lot of the Abrahamic religions around the world. And I think that making those connections live for people is significant, because indeed, you know, how I grew up, our reward was always in heaven. We were to turn a blind eye and just endure our suffering because at the end of our life, great would be our reward, this sort of thinking. And that can be very problematic in my view, because it kind of allows us to kind of accept our reality and not really it doesn't really move us to change things in a way that perhaps a different religious outcome might, right? Our job is to let go and let God. Our job is to, whatever. And I believe if people knew the connections to the African traditions, and I'd love for you to tell the story of the virgin birth and any others that come to mind. But I know that when I heard those connections, I recognized, wow, okay, there's something deeper here. So please, we can start with the virgin birth narrative that made its way to Christianity, but I know that there are many others.
Okay, well, before I do that, let me just say that you have accurately described the purpose of Christianity here in the Americas.
Yeah.
The purpose of
And I'm a Christian too. I grew up Christian. I want to make sure I said I'm not. I don't hate anybody. I'm not. But go ahead,
Look,
please.
I grew up in a Christian environment as well.
Okay.
By virtue of the fact that our grandparents were Christians, we
Absolutely.
inherited their belief,
Mm-hmm.
and so without going into a long history of that, the purpose of religion, as it has been presented to us here in America by the very same people who stole us, enslaved us, lynched us, raped us, they taught us how to cultivate a relationship with God. Now, if they were true Christians, true followers of the faith, and had not violated one of the 10 commandments, thou shalt not steal, we'd be having this conversation under a mango tree somewhere in the west coast of Africa, right? So religion has been used as a tool to subjugate the subjugated. There's no question about that. And to make you believe in the pie in the sky. Slaves obey your master was part of the religious doctrine that was given to enslaved people only after white slave owners in the South, specifically in Georgia, became fearful of the seeds of the Haitian Revolution in 1804 spreading throughout the Americas. They decided then that it was time to introduce African people to slavery. Prior to that, it was illegal for Africans to be Christians. They didn't believe that Africans had a soul. Pope Eugenius IV in the 15th century issued a papal bull, which gave Portuguese and then Spain permission to steal Africans because the Pope said that Africans had no soul. They're not human beings. So we have to understand first and foremost the role that religion has played in the establishment of the slave trade, which lasted for 444 years. As a matter of fact, just recently, the Church of England has issued a paper apologizing for their role in expanding the slave trade. The British were the most financially successful enslavers on the planet. They made more money than any other European nation selling African flesh. And the Church of England has just recently acknowledged that and said that they're going to pay some form of reparations, right? So the reality is the religions of the Abrahamic faith, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, were derived from spiritual traditions that originated in the Nile Valley at least 2,000 years before Abraham was born. So you asked me to tell the story of the Assyrian drama. Once you understand foundational African history, it shifts your understanding of everything else. And either your mind becomes open and you begin to pursue more of this information, or you suffer from cognitive dissonance and the information that you're hearing conflicts with what you have been socialized to believe in, and you shut down and reject that information because it makes you psychologically, emotionally, and maybe even physically uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. So this story that I'm going to share with you is the foundational story of Kemet, ancient Egypt. It is a story that is at least 6,000 years old. And just recently, about a decade or so ago, I found out talking with an Ethiopian colleague of mine that this story actually originated in Ethiopia and is more likely 10,000 years old. But the short version of the story is this. The civilization that we know of Kemet, i.e. ancient Egypt, was founded by a man by the name of Asar, who united the two lands, established the first government. He introduced agriculture. He introduced writing, and also established the first theology, the first religion, if you will. Asar married a woman by the name of Aset, and we're talking about two African people, indigenous African people. And if the story of the Ethiopian origins of the story are true, we know that they came from Northeast Africa, which is the region where paleoanthropologists have determined the first humans lived, right? So Asar, after he established the nation of Kemet, which is the original name for the country we now call Egypt, decided to travel to other areas of Africa and share this knowledge, share this technology with them to bring them into the light, and left his wife to run their nation, which means that his wife, Aset, was not subservient to him. She was his co-equal, and she had enough bandwidth, mental bandwidth, to carry on the operations of this nation. Now, according to the story, there's multiple versions of the story. Asar was murdered by his brother Set. And in one version of the story, Set dismembered Asar, cut his body into 14 pieces, and scattered them throughout the land. Set was forced to flee for her life, and she went searching for the missing parts of her husband's body. She found 13 of the 14 parts of Asar's body. As she found each body part, she washed it, she anointed it with oils, and then literally Aset remembered her husband. She reassembled his body and then wrapped his body in bandages, thus creating the first mummy in recorded history. Mm-hmm. And she then proceeded to bury her husband. It took Aset 70 days to find the missing pieces of her husband's body and to prepare his body for burial. So in Kemet, in Egypt, for the next 3,000 years, the process of mummification lasted for 70 days. So that's how important this story, which I have to share with you and your listeners, this story is a myth. Mm-hmm. It is not true, but it contains truth, right? Mm-hmm. It is a myth. So according to this myth, this documented myth, Aset, as she was about to bury her husband, grieved because she was still a virgin. She and her husband had never consummated their marriage before he left to go on his journey and was murdered. So the spirit of Asar visited his wife Aset and impregnated her. And if you said you had gone to Egypt on your 40th birthday. So if you went to, did you go to the temple of Abydos on that trip?
I'm not sure. I can't remember the name. I went to the temple where the Sphinx is. I know that.
I would know, but that's in Giza. Okay. Abydos is south, about 200 miles south.
Is that by Luxor?
That's before you get to Luxor.
Okay. All right. No, I didn't know.
Abydos is where the oldest existing temple in Egypt still is. It was a temple that was started by Seti I, the father of Ramesses II, the father of the man that you were named after. Mm. It's one of the most remarkable temples in Egypt. It was built around 1350 BCE. Mm-hmm. And in that temple is an image of Aset being impregnated by her deceased husband. So this story, this myth, becomes the first story in recorded history of what Christians refer to as an immaculate conception. Yeah. And then 9 months later, the virgin Aset gave birth to her son, Heru. Heru was born of a virgin. Heru was born on the same birth date as his father, Asar, December the 25th. Heru was born to avenge the murder of his father, and his responsibility was to reclaim his father's throne. Mm. Ultimately, if you went to, on that trip to Egypt, if you went to the temple of Edfu, then that is a temple on the way to Aswan that is dedicated to Heru, the son of Asar and Aset. And in that temple, you will see carved on the walls images that depict the story of Heru as an adult battling his uncle Set, the man who murdered his father, and defeating Set, and then becoming the legitimate heir to the throne of his father. And as part of that story, as part of that narrative, when Heru ascended to the throne and became the king of Kemet, his father Asar was resurrected from the dead and took his place in the ancestral realm on the throne of judgment. So Asar then became the person who judged the souls of all the dead, all the deceased people who came before him on Judgment Day. Now, these elements, essential elements of this myth, this African myth, which is at least 2,000 years older than Genesis in the Torah, serve as the foundation for Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And this story of these faiths were derived from an African myth, which has had the African essence stripped away from it and has been reinterpreted first by people who classified themselves as Hebrews, and then later reinterpreted again by people who classify themselves as Christians, and then later still reinterpreted by people who classify themselves as Muslims. Mm-hmm. So what I know, based on my study of history, is that through an accurate interpretation of historical events, you can find the African seed, the African DNA in many aspects of lives or traditions, cultural traditions that have been attributed to other people. And that's one of the reasons why this information is suppressed. Because if you find out that the story of Jesus Christ is a reinterpretation of the story of an African family, then that will cause you to look at religion differently and ask yourself, what else has been co-opted from African stories that we've never been taught?
Yeah.
And if Europeans were responsible for teaching you the story of Christianity, you have to ask yourself, what other information, African information, have they not told you that if you were aware of and applied in your life could radically alter your trajectory through life here in the United States of America? So people are controlled, as I said, people are controlled not so much by what they know, but why they don't know, which is why, for me, acquisition of this information and dissemination of this information is so critical to me, because I understand its ability to dramatically alter the thinking of millions of people throughout the world and ultimately change the trajectory of the world. That's what's at stake.
Sure. And I think that's kind of what I was trying to suggest when we first started talking. My father would share a lot of the histories of the stories that were found in the Bible, the sources. I remember just off the top of my head one where he the story of like Noah's Ark. The roots of that story were they come from ancient Sumeria, something like that. Mm-hmm. And then they made their way into the Bible. And because of the fact that folks don't know that, and they take the Bible literally, which is what we're taught to do. We take this literally happened. These are the actual words, and this is actually what happened. And any conflict that we, come about on our own, just based on our own reasoning, or any conflict that we see from this chapter to the next chapter, or this book to the next book in the Bible itself, we're not supposed to question God. These things, the responsibility never sits squarely in our lap for our lives and the trajectory of our lives. The responsibility always lies elsewhere in the universe. It could be with other people, the devil, God, who knows. And so you tying the story of Jesus himself, or the roots of that virgin birth, that immaculate conception story, to this African myth, in that conversation that I saw many years ago. That was pivotal for me because I'm like, that's it. That's the missing key, because the Sumerian story, that's obviously that's Old Testament. People get tricky about that sort of stuff, and everyone has a way to make it work for them. But once you get to that one pivotal moment, the Immaculate Conception upon which everything else is based, the entire religion, in fact, and you can draw very clear connections to this African story. Not only does it put African people at the center of this religion, which is necessary, but it also kind of allows us to now put the responsibility of this faith that we have for so long taken to be absolutely true, and start to, again, pull back some of the responsibility for where we stand politically, what actions we take and don't take, and how we reason and make sense of the world in which we live. So again, I appreciate you sharing that story, and I recognize there's more ways for people to get involved and get this knowledge firsthand. I know for a time, and I'm not sure if it's still true, that you would invite folks on these trips or pilgrimages to Kemet. And perhaps there are still many ways at IKG to get involved with the proactive rediscovery of ancient African history and culture, and perhaps even to assist in the organization's efforts to help other folks do the same. So let's talk about that. How can folks get involved if they want to themselves experience all that?
Okay. Well, before I do that, let me comment on what you just said.
Please, yes.
And share a couple of facts that I think will be illuminating for those of your listeners who are willing to receive this information. One fact is that the letter J wasn't introduced until the 16th century. The letter J was not introduced into the English language until the 16th century, which means that Jesus' name wasn't Jesus. So all of these years, folk have been calling on Jesus. It's like dialing the wrong number and expecting to get the party that you're trying to call. Yeah. It doesn't work, but your former enslaver never told you that. Yeah. The other important issue is this idea of the Immaculate Conception. Now, Catholics would tell you that people's use of the term Immaculate Conception is erroneous because the Immaculate Conception refers to Mary being born of a virgin. Not Mary the Virgin giving birth to Jesus. So there's so much about religion that we've never been taught. And as a consequence, we don't have a real understanding of this system and how it really works. Another point I want to make is that you find in the Abrahamic faith, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the story of a fall from grace. Now, if you were to ever read books on comparative religion, you'll find that is not the dominant point of view of other religions throughout the world. That is a minority view. In other religions, there never was a fall from grace. There never was a separation from the Creator, from God, if you will. Okay. So if you look at African spiritual traditions from that perspective, human beings were born as instruments of the Creator. And let's just use the word God. It's inappropriate to describe this process, but I'll just use it because it's a word that everybody's familiar with, that we were never separated from God. We are the vessels, human beings are the vessels through which the energy of God, the presence of God works through. And once you understand that and are socialized to know that you have a direct connection to the Creator, then it's the role of society to train you how to use that connection for the benefit of your society, right? So you learn how to think, you learn how to reason so that you, as an instrument of the Creator, can create heaven on earth.
How about that?
And that's what you see when you travel to Egypt today to study the history of ancient Kemet. You travel there to see monuments, temples, and structures that were built 3, 4, 5,000 years ago by human beings who knew that they were instruments through which the Creator can express itself so that they could create heaven on earth. That's the essence of Kemet. That's the most simple explanation that I can give you for what Kemet really is. It's the longest documented example of what human beings who just happen to be Africans in Africa were able to do when they lived their lives expressing their connection to divinity. They were never separated from God. So they had the capacity to create heaven on earth. And that when they died, then their spirit would ascend into heaven and connect with Asar, who was the Lord of resurrection, who would evaluate how you lived your life on earth. And that evaluation would prepare you for your next return to earth. Now, understand and process that, man. And it's in all the texts. Mm-hmm. It's in all the texts. So in ancient Kemet, they had this concept of the Rehemi Mesu. Rehemi Mesu means the repetition of the birth, or what we call in Western vernacular reincarnation. Mm-hmm. So in other words, they knew that we come back and that we have always come back. And the quality of life you will live in a future life is determined by the quality of life that you lived in your previous life. That's why kings name their sons not after themselves, but after their grandfathers, because it was the belief that the spirit of their grandfather, the spirit of their ancestor, was going to express itself in the body of that child, right? So that's African spirituality, right? Spirit never dies. The body is temporary, but spirit never dies. And so what you have with religion is this separation of human beings from their creator. You were born in sin. Wow. You fell from grace. So you now have to submit yourself to these rules and these laws, so that if you live a righteous life on earth, you will get your reward in heaven. And if you don't do this, you will live eternity in hell. For me, I interpret that, because of what I know, that's spiritual abuse
and manipulation. Sure,
it's manipulation, and so that is my interpretation of the world in which we live now. But you can find, as many have found, by returning to the source, you'll find that much of this information is still available and still accessible. But you have to pretty much make your own way, because this knowledge has not been institutionalized in the society in which we live. And you'll be considered, oh, here he comes talking that African stuff again, talking that African voodoo again, that African spirituality, because folk don't know and don't know that they don't know. It's the blind leading the blind.
Yeah.
So the importance of the work that we do at IKG is about presenting alternative truths. And I don't believe in proselytizing. Everybody has the right to believe what they want to believe. If you want to believe in the Jewish story, or the Islamic story, or the Christian story, that is your right. And I'm not trying to deprive you of your right to believe what you want to believe.
Right.
What I know is that belief is something you accept without proof. And when I'm making accessible to people is documented proof of who we were and what we did when we were in control of our own lives. And that information is accessible to anyone who's willing to invest the time and read and study and apply this knowledge, apply these principles in their lives. And if you are aware enough and comfortable enough to internalize this information and to apply this information in your life and see that it adds value to your life and the life of the people in your household, your mate, your children, your other relatives, then that gives you the tools to be able to live your life as a creator. You're not God, but you have the essence of the creator within you. You have the capacity to create things, marvelous things, that can improve your quality of life. And you don't have to beg anybody for anything. You don't have to pray for this. You don't have to pray for that. You have the capacity to bring into existence those things that will benefit you and your family. And that's the truth as I have come to know it.
That's wonderful. You know, there's something really interesting about this, and I don't want to, like you, I don't want to upset anyone, but a question that I've always had, that I believe, you know, I kind of uncovered some deeper truths within my own journey in that regard. The question was always, if God, the Christian God that I grew up knowing, was all powerful and all perfect, which, you know, that's what we accept, then why would God intentionally create imperfect beings and then demand that those beings be perfect or else face damnation? Because that felt cruel. And then on top of that, if God can do anything and God wanted to make an army of people just to cultivate a relationship with him or her and just worship, then why would God and all of God's might not just make it that way? Why do we need to eat and go to the bathroom and wash our hair, these sorts of things? You know, if God wanted it a certain way, why do it? And then, you know, whenever I would ask folks, you know, outside of, you know, my home life, those questions, oftentimes I would run into these roadblocks. And again, those roadblocks were often, you know, who are we to question God? And, you know, to have reason and then to have logic and then not be able to use it, to have truth, ancient truths, like the truths that you uncover and have uncovered throughout your career, and then turn a blind eye to them. It feels very, it's saddening in a lot of ways that I was not educated and still have a long way to go. I'd never professed to know enough in this lifetime, but I think I'm saying that to say that I appreciate the work that you've done. There are people who are on our own journey, folks that may never, ever get to have these type of conversations with you that you've absolutely inspired. And those people are grateful for the work that you've done, because you certainly have given us an aperture into these sort of areas where information is sort of siloed, that allows us to connect and, funnily enough, remember who we are and who we were always intended to be. And so before we let you, I know I've taken up way too much of your time. Any last thoughts? And then naturally, I'd love for you to plug, again, your books, your social media, website, all that sort of stuff.
Sure. One of the things that I like to reference, share with audiences, is a quote from James Madison. Mm-hmm. James Madison was the fourth president of the United States. He's a man who is considered the author of the U.S. Constitution. James Madison was an enslaver. And there is a building on Capitol Hill that is part of the Library of Congress complex that is named in honor of James Madison. Mm-hmm. And as you walk into this, before you walk into the building, at the entrance to the building, there is a quote from Madison to the left of the entranceway. And I want to share that quote with your listeners.
Please.
And it says, "Knowledge will forever govern ignorance. And a people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power which knowledge gives." Mm. This is James Madison, right? Knowledge will forever govern ignorance. And the people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power which knowledge gives. So knowledge is power. James Madison, the writer of the U.S. Constitution, knew the power of knowledge. Madison also wrote in the Constitution, Article 1, Section 3 of the Constitution, he referred to enslaved Africans as 3/5 of a human being, that we were not human beings. It was illegal during the time that the Constitution was written. It was illegal for enslaved Africans to read or write. In other words, they did everything within their power to limit our access to knowledge. Why? Because knowledge will forever govern ignorance. We were intentionally kept away from this information so that we would remain ignorant and remain under their control. So the purpose of of IKG is to remove the blinders, to remove all traces of ignorance, so that we can become literate people, conscious people. And as a consequence of being literate and conscious, we then could use the knowledge that we've gained to become the masters of our destiny. And that is the greatest expression of freedom. If you don't have the freedom, if you don't have the right to know who you are and to use that knowledge to make life better for your children, for your community, then you are not free.
Mm.
And freedom is something that can never be given to you, can never be legislated. So we have an opportunity to study, to read, and to change the trajectory of our lives. And I can share with you, I can share with your listeners that 99% of our folk are not going to do it because they don't believe it, or they lack the capacity to read and study for themselves. So in every instance, and I close on this, in every instance, it's always been a handful of people who carried the light, kept the flame of knowledge lit so that it could be preserved and passed down to future generations. And it's always a handful of people who initiate actions which change the trajectory of human history. Mm. That has always been the case. And it's not going to be any different in the 21st century. So we're going to be approaching a time of dramatic shift within our society, a shift within our consciousness, and it's that shift that will determine how quickly we can move into a future that will allow us to save society and ultimately save the planet. There is no question beyond a shadow of a doubt that climate change is real.
Right.
Politicians, business people who created this climate crisis have known this for over 25, 30 years. They've known this and they've denied this. Why? Because they were interested in making money. But now we've reached a point where it can no longer be denied, and the future of all life on this planet is at stake. So people will have opportunities now to free themselves from those psychological, emotional, and spiritual chains that have bound them for countless generations, and create or work with other people, other like-minded people, to create a new world for us to live in order to sustain the human race and be able to preserve knowledge for the benefit of those who have not been born. And that's probably one of the greatest expressions of freedom that any person living in the United States could participate in. And if you do that, that will make your life truly worth living, and allow you to become an ancestor whom future generations, 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now, will celebrate you, will remember your name because of the changes that you've made in their lives. And that's what this whole process is all about. So IKG, our website, ikg-info.com, is a place where you can go to see our books that are available, to purchase downloads of lectures that deal with discussions similar to the ones that we've had in this past 90 minutes. You can also find information about our regular study tours to Egypt, so that you can, if you have the resources, come and participate in a life-transforming experience and become the person that I would like to think you were born here on earth to become, and not just be someone who follows the rules of miseducation designed to limit your capacity to grow as a human being.
Mr. Browder, you are absolutely a hero of mine, and I can't thank you enough for coming on the show. So, I appreciate you sharing your insight. And of course, I appreciate your commitment to the successful, informed, and inspired future of the Black community. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, our guest is author, publisher, historian, artist, and educational consultant, director of the ASA Restoration Project, and founder and director of IKG Cultural Resource Center, the cultural memory specialist, Mr. Anthony T. Browder.
Thank you, brother. It's been my pleasure.